Good morning. Thank you for being here. And we're kicking off the 18th annual capabilities demonstration for StarTides. We began in 2007 over at National Defense University. And we're now here at George Mason. So our morning keynote, I'm very pleased to have with us Andrew Selee, who is the president of the Migration Policy Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institute to promote improved policies on migration, understanding of migration issues. He's been with them since 2017. Before that, he was with the Woodrow Wilson Center for a long time. And his expertise particularly is in Latin America and in the Americas and the Caribbean. But he will talk to us today about the global issues going on in migration policy around the world, and thus setting the stage for the future, for the panels. So without further ado, Dr. Selee.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
My pleasure. Good to have you.
Thank you. Let me grab my notes over here. So
okay.
I say something coherent this morning. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me without a microphone? I will go into the microphone, but you can hear me, I assume, right? Yes. Thank you, Dr. Wells, for the invitation to be here. It's great to be with you this morning. Let me talk a little bit about displacement around the world, and I'm going to, I want to give you some pessimistic notes about where we're headed, but also end with some possibilities of where we may end up in the future that could actually be fruitful and positive. Let me start by saying that conflict is a feature and not a bug of the world we live in. It has been true forever. People have been displaced throughout history because of wars, because of famines, because of changes in government, because of political and religious and ethnic and linguistic and go down the line differences. There is a great book by Ian Golding called The Shortest History of Migration, which actually goes through migration over millennia. It's the only book I've seen so far that really covers this in some detail and it really looks completely around the world. I mean, it's actually one of the few books on migration that is not heavily North American or European, but it really gives you a breadth of how much, and it just came out actually at the beginning of this year, it gives you a breadth of how much people, migration is at the heart of human evolution and encounters and, The Shortest History of Migration. So it's about 250 pages, not as short as it sounds when you see, but on the other hand, for covering a global history of migration through millennia, it's pretty damn short. So you'll excuse my language. There was a period where we thought that the development of a shared international order might manage to constrain some of the sources of conflict. We, came to believe, maybe in the 1990s that we were in a less conflictive world, that there was an international order taking hold, that there were, some of the sources of conflict and instability that forced people to flee might be constrained, would not disappear, and there was some evidence that happened. And there was also a gradual shift towards freer, more open, more democratic societies. Not always the same thing, by the way, but certainly towards societies where people had greater liberties, and a belief in international rules and institutions, or at least the exercise of international rules and institutions. But, after a period of relative, if only partial stability, I think we are, at least in historical perspective, we've returned to a much more multipolar world. We've returned to a world where I don't think anyone today would assume that the liberal international order is, healthy and universally accepted. And it's not merely because China doesn't feel like they were part of creating it. It's also because the United States is not sure it believes in it, right? The U.S. government, there are many sources, or, Russia is sort of going rogue and has sort of always been testing the boundaries. No, this is actually many sources of pulling back from the liberal international order. And this leads to the fact that many conflicts, it's much harder to constrain conflicts when they happen, major shifts in government when they happen, and many conflicts become fodder, as they did throughout history, for other countries intervening for their own strategic purposes, right? We should assume that many conflicts that start off being local conflicts end up becoming conflagrations because outside powers have an interest also in intervening for their own purposes. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that we have the highest rate of displacement in world history. UNHCR loves to say this. I will give you their figures in a minute. People are fleeing conflicts great and small and seeking protection in other countries and sometimes within their own country. UNHCR estimates about 40 million refugees around the world. That's the people that they recognize, they or other UN agencies would recognize as refugees and displaced people, and about 70 million internally displaced people. I would say those numbers are a little fuzzier than they sound. It always sounds great when you have a hard number, and there's good reasons to give people hard numbers, but in some ways these numbers both underestimate and overestimate. And it depends what you're counting. And here is a crucial thing that is worth understanding is that, yes, there are a lot of people displaced, but it isn't clear that there are more people displaced today as a percentage of humanity than at other moments in history. But two things have changed. There are more people displaced right now than 10 years ago, than 20 years ago. That is true. We do actually have some way of measuring that. But two things have changed, and they're good things, actually, but they also have consequences. One is that we count people a lot better, right? There were a lot of people being displaced in the continent of Africa decades ago who never got counted as displaced people because those who were doing the counting didn't know about it, right? Technology has made it possible for people everywhere to know things that are going on in other parts of the world. So we have a better sense of people who are being displaced, right? We've also expanded how we judge people, the criteria we use to understand who's a displaced person. There was a time where the criteria, particularly on refugees, was very narrowly drawn, right? You had to be persecuted essentially by your government for one of very restricted reasons. Generally, it got expanded a little bit to people who are fleeing war. Now we have a much more expanded definition, right? A lot of the things people flee from are not governments coming after them. They're non-state actors coming after them, right? I mean, it could be a drug cartel. It could be a local gang. It could be, criminal groups, and the government is unwilling or unable to protect them. And so we've stretched our understanding of both who's a refugee and who's a displaced person. I'm using both terms because they're slightly different. Refugees are people who are recognized by the international refugee regime under the 1951 Convention, the 1967 Protocol. It is a more about displaced people are a slightly broader category. And even UNHCR, which is the guardian of the 1951 Convention and the definition of refugees, understands there's a broader group of people who don't necessarily have refugee protection, but any rational person would say that they've clearly been displaced. And there's really good discussions going on today about, someone displaced by climate change. Are they, should they be considered displaced? I mean, increasingly when someone's displaced by a climate event, like a hurricane, we recognize them as being displaced. Right now, whether it is sort of the broader, if they live in Niger and their livelihood on the edge of the Sahara has become, much more difficult to sustain over time, and they move, are they also displaced, right? I mean, those are debates that are happening now. We're still sort of stretching the definition. However, as we stretch the definition, it also puts a greater burden on a refugee regime and our notions of how to respond to displacement that are actually hard to respond to. And let me point to three things that are going on which should worry us right now. And then I'll come back and I'll talk about three things where there's innovation going on that may show us the direction of the future. So one is asylum. I mean, everyone here lives in the United States, not necessarily from the United States, but lives in the United States, I'm guessing. So you're no stranger. And by the way, you'd have to be under a rock somewhere in the world if you've, sort of missed everything going on in this country. Even people around the world are paying attention to things happening here. The center of the debate on immigration in the United States is really a debate around people arriving and seeking asylum at the border. And it's the center of the debate in Europe as well, right? It's the people arriving and seeking asylum. Asylum systems, I'm going to say something very controversial, but asylum systems as they exist, which once dealt with very small and select numbers of people, right? Groups of people that managed very few claims and that in the end adjudicated very few claims, very specific sets of persecution. Because we've expanded who is covered, and because technology and communications and transportation have allowed more people to move in ways they couldn't have at another moment, asylum systems have largely become unworkable in many countries. They're incredibly important in neighboring countries when conflict happens. But the idea that people can move through multiple countries and arrive in a country of their choice to seek asylum is unlikely to survive well, has not survived in this country. I mean, there is effectively no asylum at the U.S. border. It's unlikely to survive in Europe much longer, and I think the Canadians are looking at how they put considerable restrictions on as well. Asylum is unlikely to be, if we are lucky, we can preserve it as a method of protection of last resort, which is what I would argue, we've been arguing for a while, would be the best thing to do, is look at it as having stricter criteria, as having orderly processes. But if we continue to see it as wide open in the way it has been, it is very hard to sustain over time, because no matter how many resources you put into the asylum system, they're not going to keep up with the number of people applying, and that leads to a general pushback against immigrants and against asylum seekers, and ultimately hurts those who need protection. And it is part of the loss of credit. And by the way, we should acknowledge, for those that believe protection matters, we should acknowledge many people apply for asylum not because they're seeking protection, but because some people are, but some people apply because it's the only way of getting into the country. So, it is an incentive. It creates an incentive which is perfectly rational. We should not blame people for doing this, but we should understand that as a policy matter, it is, it does create legitimate questions from others who say, wait a minute, who are these people who are applying, and how many should actually be seeking protection versus coming in by other ways? And I'll come back to how we should deal with that in some of the innovations here. Secondly, we have lots and lots, increasing numbers of people in displacement who are in protracted situations. And by the way, that's always true, unfortunately, which is we tend to think, Ukraine will be done, the war in Ukraine will be done in 2 years. The Venezuelan government will collapse, or the Nicaraguan government, and, transition to democracy. That civil war in Sudan, is a momentary fight between two factions. One of them will win, the war will end, and these things tend to go on and on. There's no way that Assad could survive much longer, and he does, finally didn't, but, does and does. We tend to assume this. And by the way, by the time conflicts end, look at Syria, right? By the time conflicts end, okay, Assad is no longer bombing his people. Most folks have settled somewhere else. They're integrated somewhere else, and they have legitimate questions about whether it's safe to return, right? Even if the source of the original reason for fleeing is gone, there is still deep instability, right? Gaddafi is gone. Well, Libya is not a whole lot better necessarily, right, for people to return to. So you could sort of look at some of these and say, these become protracted situations. Generally, our way of taking care of displaced people has been what I tend to call care and feeding, which is we, put people in refugee camps, or if not, even if they're in urban areas where the majority of refugees are today, they're often being maintained for long periods of time without the ability to integrate fully in the society where they're living. They are segregated in various ways to keep them separate, and they're maintained for very long. And by the way, host countries, after a while, get tired of that, right? And there begins to be a pushback. And particularly when there are difficult times, we saw this in Turkey a couple of years ago, election coming up, massive inflation, become easy scapegoats, right? Or in Lebanon, where there are multiple conflicts going on, right? So there are ways of dealing with this, but we should be aware that this is a serious concern. And third and finally, for countries that are the primary donors, including the United States, and we have just seen USAID blow up, right, or be blown up, together with other institutions. But we're also seeing the UK and Germany cutting back on their aid budgets. Donor countries also get tired of maintaining people in protracted displacement. And we're seeing a cutback of refugee resettlement in the United States as well. It goes in tandem with this. And still skepticism in many other countries towards refugee resettlement. The U.S. and Canada are by far and away the two largest countries of refugee resettlement. Even with that, we were only resettling about 1% of eligible refugees around the world. And now the U.S. is largely pulled out of this. We'll see if something survives out of the refugee resettlement program. So after that, we'll go have a good conference. No, let me give you a little bit of hope, though, which is I think there's 3 sets of innovations. We have been trying to look at, we have a project called Beyond Territorial Asylum, but it's really sort of a larger body of work we've been doing. We're looking at where is innovation in dealing with displacement around the world. And we think there's at least 3 areas that we should be looking at and that are ripe for expansion. One is not new, but it has really taken off in recent years. And that's the emphasis not on care and feeding displaced people, but on integrating them, on giving them access to labor markets, to education, sometimes to healthcare systems, and to, basically not taking care of them, but allowing them to be self-sustaining, independent, have dignified lives, and contribute to the host society where they live. Okay, and we're seeing this with Ukrainians in Europe, right? I mean, the European response to Ukraine has a lot of serendipity involved. I mean, I happen to be in Brussels. We have 10 colleagues in Brussels, and so we have a fairly substantial office, and just happened to be with the director of our Europe office the week after they had approved the temporary protection for Ukrainians. So we got a bit of like the inside story from the people that were in the room. I mean, part of the reason why Europe decided to do temporary protection, because Europe moves very slowly, and they move very quickly on this, is they realized that Ukrainians had visa-free travel to Europe. And they were coming one way or the other. Unless they were going to cancel visa-free travel, which would be highly unpopular at the time they were supposedly supporting Ukraine, they were going to have to deal with people arriving. And so giving people temporary protection was better than everyone coming in and applying for asylum, right? So it was they exercised this thing called the Temporary Protection Directive, gave people a year, and then 2 years and 3 years. Now they have to figure out what to do because they're in 3 years, but they'll figure something out. And basically, Ukrainians come in and they're eligible in some countries like Germany. They give them housing support and all sorts of other things, and a monthly stipend. But in other countries like Spain, they get a little bit of temporary integration if they need it. They can go to a shelter for a while, and then they're on their own, right? So it depends. Countries with very developed refugee systems have given people the gold-plated standard, which is costing a lot of money and creating some debate in countries like Germany. But if you're going to Spain or Portugal, you're kind of on your own. You get a little bit of transition assistance, but but the bet has been ultimately they're allowed to work. Their kids are allowed to go to school. They're eligible for health care. Now, Ukrainians may return at some point if there's peace, but whether they do or not, there is actually, the time that they're in Europe, that most of them are working, most of the kids are in school, they actually are contributing to the economy. Right? And it's a non-issue in the places where there's no public support beyond 3 months, right? Like Spain. I mean, it's simply not a political issue whatsoever because these are just people who are in the labor force like anyone else. But we've seen Uganda do something similar with refugees, actually give people the right to work. We saw this with the Venezuelans who went to Latin America. Most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, with some exceptions. I can go deep on this one if anyone wants, because we just finished a book on Latin American migration policies, but I won't bore you with it. But let's just say most countries have opted for some sort of temporary protection that allows people to work and their kids to go to school and some health care access. And not that it's without some political conflict, but we haven't seen the development of anti-immigration parties or huge pushbacks in Latin America, possible exception of Chile, some moments in Peru. I mean, there have been incidents without any doubt, but overall it hasn't become the same sort of political issues because after a period of transition, most people are working. You may not like the music. I mean, it's sort of fun to see, people in Colombia go, oh, so son nuestros hermanos, they're our brothers and sisters, just suddenly like, oh, we can't stand their music, they're not at all like us. And yeah, we can divide ourselves on all sorts of ways, right? I mean, we're human beings, we're capable of finding how different we are. We're so close to someone one moment, the next moment we're going, oh, their life experience is nothing like mine, right? But in fact, overall, they've had a fairly easy process of integrating with much less political conflict because they are contributing to the economy. It's a fairly highly educated population overall, which is helpful probably, but also simply the fact that they're not being taken care of. They're actually taking care of themselves. Turkey did something similar with Syrians, not quite as extensive like Uganda. Say Turkey and Uganda are sort of mixed cases, but they're closer to allowing people to be self-sufficient than trying to take care of them. The second thing is, I think you see in the aid community and in the foundation community the beginnings of endorsing this and beginning to understand that you can make investments that are not about maintaining people year after year, but about helping them transition to livelihoods. I would be surprised. Well, nothing surprises me these days, but I am going to guess that over time you will see some U.S. development aid return. There is some that has been preserved, but you will see. But the emphasis they will be much more comfortable in this administration with issues of transitioning people to livelihoods, working with the private sector on hiring people who are in protracted displaced situations, investing in labor market solutions. There is a constituency in donor countries for this as well. Care and feeding ultimately is hard to convince publics of in democratic societies. And third reason for hope, the third set of innovations have to do about rethinking pathways for displaced people. In the past, our primary pathway has been refugee resettlement. It's really not that big. I mean, even the Biden administration that got to 100,000, that's still a drop in the bucket, right? I mean, the Canadians are somewhere around there. It's, 1% of the eligible people will ever get resettled. Now, not everyone wants to be resettled, by the way. I should say many people, in fact, you give them a choice of living a dignified life near their home country that they hope to return to in a place that maybe speaks the same language. They might prefer that, by the way, over being resettled. But some people would like to get out of situations where they're unlikely to have a dignified life. But there's a set of things going on that are interesting. One is sponsorship. We saw this in the US and Canada and UK around Ukraine. We saw it around Afghans. We're allowing people to sponsor relatives, friends, or simply unknown people that they wanted to help so that they can come into the country on different sorts of pathways. Canada has institutionalized this. Canada's the one real experiment where individuals and groups of individuals and institutions can sponsor people to come as refugees above the cap, right? So it's additive to those that are being resettled by the government. There's also a cap on that, but that's about half of the resettlement right now in Canada is through people who are sponsored. And the idea there is they don't get as many services as the people who are getting officially resettled. Resettlement is really costly, by the way. But if you have a sponsor, the sponsor is responsible then for those services, right? For helping you transition to the labor market, for helping you figure out how to navigate the school system, to sign up for any benefits. There's a little bit of hand-holding in Canada, as there was in the US with Ukrainians and later Venezuelans and others. But it's not a lot of hand-holding, right? And it sort of returns to, you actually use ways of getting the public engaged in building pathways for people to come. There's also a lot of experimentation around employment-based pathways. Let me say on sponsorship too. I mean, the big one in the Biden administration, which was controversial, but I actually thought was quite interesting, was the CHNV pathway, United for Ukraine, where they allowed Americans to sponsor anyone legally present in the U.S. Did have to be American, actually. CHNV. Yeah, but United for Ukraine was bringing in Ukrainians sponsored by Americans. Then they did it for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. CHNV, Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans. And actually quite large numbers, about 30,000 a month. They did not have to prove they were refugees. They were all coming from societies that either were highly unstable, like Haiti, or had authoritarian governments, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. But they didn't have to prove they were individually worthy. All they had to show is they had a sponsor in the U.S., and the sponsor had to request them. It was an interesting idea. They could have had more controls built in. There was some evidence of fraud in about 7-8% of the cases, which is high, although most of that fraud was sort of minimal stuff. It was people who were sort of selling themselves as sponsors, which sounds an awful lot about how most people actually were coming to the border also. So not to say it doesn't matter, but on the other hand, it was sort of the similar, it was not people being trafficked. It was primarily some people who posed as sponsors who were doing this for money and were setting up arrangements through the internet on this. But you could create models like this, right, that work in large numbers, that are less about proving that everyone is a worthy refugee, but sort of takes larger groups of people, decentralizes it, and focuses on publics that are willing actually to take people in. The second part of the innovation going on pathways is around employment-based pathways, and there's a lot of this going on in different places. It's all small scale, but Canada and Spain have done a lot of bringing people as refugees, but who have specific skills that are needed. Nursing is a big one, actually. Australia has done a bit of this as well, and so in addition to the refugee pathways above that, bringing people who have needed skills, there's a lot of thinking going. Japan has started doing this. Japan has also started bringing people. I was in Japan about 3 weeks ago. Japan has also started bringing Syrians to higher education, with the idea that they then stay on and move into the workforce as well. And Japan's doing actually something really interesting too, which is in very small scale, but is actually helping Japanese companies to hire refugees in protracted displacement. They've started in Egypt with a number of different displaced populations. But they actually have them hiring them where they are. And then at some point, if they wish, the company can try and petition to bring them to Japan as workers, not as refugees, but as workers, right? But for many people, they'd rather stay in Egypt, right? I mean, they hope one day to return to their country of origin. They're from Sudan, they're from Syria. They'd rather, if I could make decent wages and stay in Egypt, that's a lot better. They've had a couple people who have actually come as workers. But this notion of thinking of displaced people not just as folks who need help, but as people who have skills, as people who may be able to contribute to the economy is a nice shift in our thinking about this. But it also is practical, which means there are a lot more pathways for employment. And in some cases, it's a question of creating new pathways that are dedicated for displaced people, but in some cases, it's simply a question of taking away some of the barriers that keep displaced people out. Like a doctor who maybe hasn't exercised the profession for 3 years because she had to flee from Nicaragua and has been in Costa Rica, but still is a doctor, right? I mean, speaks English and there's like lots of ways of doing this that don't require creating dedicated pathways for refugees, that actually would allow refugees and displaced people to move through other kinds of pathways. So I'm going to finish just by saying that I think we are facing a moment where there will be fewer options to deal with displacement. I would be, and by the way, most displaced people, over 70%, are in low and middle income countries. There is going to be less development assistance. There are going to be less resettlement going on from the global north. This is going to put pressure on countries that are hosting large displaced populations. If we are lucky, however, what comes out of this, and I'm not going to say this is a good moment, that would be an exaggeration and inaccurate, but if something good comes out of this, it will be that it forces innovation. It forces countries that can no longer do care and feeding to think about integration. It helps us rethink how we do development from the global north in terms of ways that allow people to integrate. And maybe when there are governments that are interested in pathways, we get beyond the pathways that existed and start experimenting with some of these alternative ways of going. So, thank you, Dr. Wells. That's all I got.
You have the microphone for questions? I think we need the microphone for the recording.
Oh, that's right, we have the, okay. Are we live streaming or just recording? Just recording, okay.
Testing, testing, testing. Questions?
Thank you very much. So the optimistic, it was good to hear some optimistic. What I'm interested to hear is the impact of sort of technology, AI, where you wind up not just with people in stress situations, but now the opportunity for entry-level jobs for the young people may not be there. And where does that lead us?
So I think there's all sorts of ways that technology impacts this scenario. I mean, one is it will take away entry-level jobs. On the other hand, it makes many jobs easier to do, across borders, right? And so it opens up, by the way, we've always thought about, resettling people away from where they live, but, the Japanese experience, which by the way is all about IT jobs and about training people. I mean, it's not about IT professionals living in protected space, but it's training people to do IT jobs, where they are, also tells us that not everyone needs to move, right? That there may be opportunities for giving people dignified lives in the global economy, across borders, because technology is connecting the workplace in different ways. So I think both of those are happening at the same time. AI also matters, by the way, in matching people to jobs. One of the big things, we're actually doing a project which is not at all about refugees, but it's about simply, how countries, many countries in Europe, in fact, all countries in Europe, are growing old. Some are growing old very quickly. Italy, Spain, Greece, Germany, there's some that are growing quite quickly, Portugal. Others are growing old slightly slower, but they're all growing older, right? And so figuring out, an AI, but technology in general is going to help fill some of those jobs because you don't need them, right? I mean, you can actually evolve your way out of some jobs, but not every job, right? And so increasingly they're trying to figure out how to bring in workers. It turns out to be incredibly complicated. And so we've actually had colleagues looking at, Germany, India, and actually going to both countries. I have a colleague who was in Germany and then in India, sort of looking out of our Europe office. Another who was in Bangladesh and Italy, Hungary and Vietnam. There's 4 corridors we've been looking at. I mean, really fascinating. 'Cause one of the things you realize is you can create visas to bring in people, but it turns out to be really hard to find the workers you need that actually match what you're looking for. And the flip side, there's a lot of people in the world who would really love to go work in any of those countries, but it's really hard for them to figure out that there are visa opportunities and work opportunities to go work there, right? The matching question is really a big deal, right? And so AI is part of the solution. It's not all of the solution, but it at least begins to open up the possibilities of how you connect potential workers with potential jobs, whether it involves moving or it involves staying where you are. So I think both. I mean, I think we are looking at a future where some jobs will disappear, but we're also looking at a future where some jobs will open up and others will become easier to match folks with.
So just to follow that up, because we've got panel 3 that's talking about opportunities for companies to get involved in the improving outcomes in international migration. Do you see a number of companies here in the U.S. who are trying to get into this matching
Yes.
business?
Very much so. And it's been hard because we don't have a lot of visa flexibility in the U.S. On refugees, there's a group called Talent Beyond Boundaries. There's another group that's trying to figure out how to bring people on employment-based pathways who are in displaced situations. There's another group called Tent that tries to match refugees who are already here with those in with employers. But the bigger set of interest is really about finding, if we could expand the visa opportunities, how would we find the workers that go with them, And from the worker side, it is, okay, if there were greater opportunities, and there will have to be, greater opportunities in some of the more developed economies over time. And by the way, some of the upper middle economies too, right? I mean, countries like Chile, like South Africa are actually going to have, are also going to have labor. India, by the way, which we think of as a country, I was talking with an Indian scholar last week. I mean, India we always think of as a country of emigration, right? Because it still has a lot of young people arriving at 18 who want to enter the labor force. But give it another 20 years, and India will be a country where population will start to decline and actually will be looking for workers, will have achieved at least some, upper middle income status. Hopefully we'll have some sectors that are really dynamic and need people. So, as those opportunities expand, how do you start connecting people?
Thank you, Andrew, and I appreciate you sharing some positive possibilities with us at a time where there's a lot that's not so positive. But I really, I think you're right about these 3 innovations. I think one of my concerns is there's kind of a classist element built into that, where the people who already are in a position to have skills and training and qualifications are going to be the desired refugees and some of the most vulnerable populations, especially because there's such a huge number of young people born into refugee situations who haven't had the same opportunities for education and training and even being on the job. So can you talk about that? But also, I think just the role of education, I feel like, is kind of missing from your discussion, which I think would be great.
Yes.
I'd love to hear what you think about that.
So there's been, and we'll have a chance to talk more about this in the next panel here. So yes, that's true, although right now mobility is so limited, and actually mobility on refugee resettlement has always been prioritized to the most vulnerable rather than the most skilled, right? I mean, that has been UNHCR's criteria. It's been the criteria of most governments. Now, some people who are refugees who have skills do manage to move otherwise. And by the way, where many of them move is the Gulf, which doesn't really care, right? I mean, the Gulf is where there are a lot of visas, and it has expanded over time. I have a friend who works on the Middle East, who was born in the Middle East, who reminds me frequently that there are more Syrians living in the Gulf than there are in Jordan, right? And they're not refugees, they're not counted as refugees, but they've gone there as workers, right? And so a lot of people who do have some skills or some resources, right? They may not have formal skills, but they have enough resources to figure out how to move, they have connections, figure out how to get jobs anyway. It may not be in the US and it may not be in Europe where the visa pathways are much narrower, but it may be in the Gulf, right, or some other place in the world. But yes, if we do this much more based on skills and talent, that is a risk, certainly. I would say we don't want to replace what exists on the extent we can preserve refugee resettlement. That's a really helpful thing. And I think some countries will. I think Canada will, Australia, Australia resettles about 4,000 people a year. It's not a large number. I mean, once you get beyond Canada, every other country is really quite small. I mean, quite strategically important for some countries, but really the numbers after U.S. and Canada are quite low. And we are part of a group that works closely with refugee resettling countries, and there's a lot put into this, but really beyond the U.S. and Canada, the numbers really do go down. Sponsorship is the other way. Sponsored refugees, and the experience in Canada is they do tend to be slightly more privileged but they're not more privileged necessarily in terms of education and skills, right? They're privileged in the sense that they know someone, right? And it's often a family member that got resettled before them and is now settled in Canada and therefore goes back. But often, I mean, there's also cases where people resettle their family member, and their family member says, my best friend back in the refugee camp also, can we resettle them? And so it does have sort of broader effects. So yeah, I think that's a danger. The other thing going on, by the way, is there's a huge movement right now of higher education led by Arizona State University to do education for displaced people and refugees, including in refugee camps and in urban areas and there's some also, like in Jordan, there's a specific university that works on this that is, created by a woman in Jordan and, runs her own way of doing this. There's one in Lebanon as well. I mean, there's lots of people who are looking at ways of increasing human capital. If you could combine that with the people who are thinking about how you move people, how you give people access to mobility, that's really powerful. Those are two worlds that haven't collided yet. So,
yeah, thanks very much. Very interesting and a ray of hope in an otherwise dismal environment. I wonder if you could say something about cultural issues, cultural integration. I know that you've said that what we're doing so far with refugee resettlement is a drop in the bucket. Climate change is going to bring a much greater need than we already have, and we're not meeting the need. But if you take that number of people and dump them into a region where they are not already integrated into the society, they may have different religion, different cultural practices or something, that's a recipe for conflict. And how do you manage that? And we've seen that already. I mean, some of the demonization that we've seen in France and in the U.S., the Haitians eating the dogs and cats, that. How do you manage that? How do you keep the conflict from boiling over in the recipient country so that they can actually use the employment opportunities? I mean, the Haitians in Ohio were actually really helping the local economy. Yeah. And yet we had this whole sort of demonization situation. So can you say something about that?
I don't have an easy answer to that one. And I should say, by the way, I mean, most people, I should have said at the beginning, most people actually move within their own countries, right? The displacement numbers from UNHCR are really fuzzy. No offense to UNHCR, it's not their main brief. But it's also really hard to figure out internal displacement, right? Internal displacement it overinflates people because, say, you have 7 million Colombians, most of whom moved more than 20 years ago, some of whom, they were internally displaced, but whether you keep counting people forever is a big question, right? Or, is there sort of, if people have successfully integrated and restarted. I spent a lot of time, talking. I go to Colombia a lot, so we were working closely with the government on some projects to integrate Venezuelans there. And so, talked to a lot of people who moved 20, 30, 40 years ago to Bogota or to Barranquilla. But they're pretty well integrated, right? So do we keep counting them as displaced or not? We overcount there. We undercount because a lot of people move and we don't really know why they moved, right? And they never get counted by anyone, right? And they just, of the people who have moved to Lagos over the past, or Abidjan and Cote d'Ivoire over the past, 3 decades, how many of them were just counted as sort of rural urban migrants? How many of them were actually displaced by something we would now consider, a cause of displacement? And so we also undercount in lots of ways. But I would say, most people probably move within their own countries, and that has its own tensions, right? That has its own, set of issues in each country. And then you have, immigration as a tension. I think the more you create orderly processes for people to come in, which is why I care a lot about pathways. I do think that the perception of people coming across the border in disordered ways is going to create antibodies, and whether or not we are sympathetic to those people, it is a recipe for getting a pushback in the society. So we're much better, for those of us that care about the fate of the displaced, thinking about the pathways that people can come in. So managing chaos and creating orderly pathways matter. Betting on integration matters. Giving people the chance to succeed really matters. And I would, I often feel like the world right now in immigration is polarized between people who think immigration is almost always okay and doesn't need to be controlled very much, and people who think immigration is terrible and needs to be stopped, and, it needs to be controlled, and people need to be sent back. Somewhere in the middle ground is where most people are, which is they're actually fairly open to people coming as long as they have an opportunity to work and they're contributing. They want to see them come in orderly ways. They do not want to see people getting deported who are contributing, successfully to the country. They are happy to see people get deported if they are creating mayhem and chaos, but that's actually kind of the middle ground. Right? And politically, we've ended up with these two sides that don't really represent where most people are. And that's as true in the United States as it is in Colombia or Uganda.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about the importance or the relevance of language technology and also social media. Because sometimes, for example, if people trying to get to know other cultures, they might be the only way to actually get to know them, the other cultures, is based on social media, and maybe that might be the perception you might get might be completely biased because only few people are bilingual and can translate, for example, from Hindu to Spanish, or now using English always as a people language.
Yeah. So the week that Donald Trump was inaugurated and gave his speech at the Capitol building, and I work for a studiously nonpartisan organization, so I have no opinion on who should be president of this country, but he started talking about how we're going to deport people back and this, that, and the other. 6 of the 10 top songs in the United States were by artists who had visible immigrant backgrounds. Starting with Shabuzi, by the way, whose parents are Nigerian. So if anyone has listened to a bar song, yeah, okay. Tipsy, okay, that one. Really catchy song, was #1 for 12 weeks or something. Not that I look at the Billboard 100 every week. I do, partially because I find it really relaxing. I've done it since I was in high school, but I also increasingly see it as a barometer of American society, and it's really fascinating to watch, right? Because I think social media has done 2 things, and so beyond social media. I think the fact that we have our devices with us all the time, and they're lighter devices, we're in touch with the world. And on one hand, it narrows us into groups where we accept information from people like us, and it can very much narrow what we think. And that's particularly true of political, because we increasingly see our political identities as something essential to us, and so we look for groups that reaffirm us, and so it can very much narrow us into groups that give us misinformation about people. And at the same time, it broadens our horizons in ways that wouldn't have happened in another era, right? And music is one of those things, which is why I pointed out. Which is, you've got Americans living to Afrobeats right now. Afrobeats, African music. I was listening to African music 30 years ago, and I was like a weird kid, okay? I was doing college radio, I was doing African, Latin, Caribbean music on a radio station, and I was like that weird kid, okay? So, and no one else I knew, except for a friend of mine who's from Africa, but other than that, no one had any idea about the music that I was playing. It was very weird. Now Afrobeats is like a normal thing. Reggaeton is a normal thing in the United States, right? Not just among Latinos. right? Bad Bunny is not making most of his money off Latinos anymore, or Latin Americans. He's making money off of Europeans and Americans who are not of Latino background. And, this is kind of, those two things are happening at exactly the same time. And which wins out, I don't know, because they're both equally true. It's like people both have their horizon, but it tends to be people are much more plural and diverse in their cultural tastes than their political tastes. In their political tastes, they tend to stick to the small group that affirms who they are, which is really dangerous. And the fact that someone's listening to Afrobeats, or someone's listening to, Haitian music and Haitian Creole doesn't mean that they don't believe a story about Haitians in Ohio. So, I wouldn't equate one to the other, right? I mean, one doesn't necessarily, counteract the other, but it'll be interesting to see which wins out. Both are a result of the times we live in.
I think we are out of time before the next session. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great conversation.